Welcome to episode 8 of the MicaSense podcast. This is your host, Drew Bostian. I'm here with Stephen Mangum, my co-host. Stephen, what's going on?
Howdy, Drew. Good to talk to you again. Nothing too much going on. We're going to do a flight test tomorrow, and we're going to try out Measure Ground Control, which is the flight planning and data processing solution from our new sister company, Measure, which was recently acquired by our parent company, Ag Eagle. And it'll be exciting to give that a try. It seems like it'll really be helpful for us and hopefully for our customers.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what we can do with ground control. A lot of potential for streamlining the use of our cameras and maybe even processing data afterwards. So we'll see where that goes. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. A couple weeks ago, you and Emily Sosielski and Callum Skugel hosted a Q&A session. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Stephen?
Yeah, like you said, a few weeks ago, we had a Q&A session where we had customers from all around the world who tuned in to have their questions answered online in real time. And we got a lot of really good questions. And yeah, I thought it was a really helpful tool to get a whole lot of rapid fire questions answered.
And so for this month's episode, we don't have a guest. What we're going to do is basically take some snippets of that Q&A session and share it with you all, and hopefully it'll be interesting. But yeah, so I hope you enjoy the next 20 or 30 minutes, and we'll see you on the other side.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Sosielski, and I'm a channel sales manager with MicaSense. So I work with our reseller network in North America and Western Europe specifically. So I'm joined today by Callum and Stephen, my colleagues. We wanted to do this Ask MicaSense Hour to have it be an open forum for any questions for current customers or for potential customers that might be doing custom integrations or different kind of data processing analytics workflows and have more detailed technical questions for us. And to start it off, in the meantime, we'll do some quick introductions. So I'll pass it off to Callum Skugel first, who's our sales engineer.
Hello, everyone. Callum Skugel here. Sales engineer at MicaSense. Typically working with resellers, advanced researchers, software providers, helping with the processing and analytics of data, of our multispectral data, and how to get the best information that we can from our data. I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Callum. So I'm Stephen, and I lead the support team here at MicaSense, and I mainly just help out all customers and even potential customers who have any questions about or need help with getting started with the sensors and any technical trouble they have.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. Alrighty. So yeah, feel free to enter in those questions now, and we'll get those started. Yeah, one question I see here, can you integrate the ultim with the dual? So with the dual camera system. The dual camera is the only one we have set up to do that kind of the synchronized triggering. So we have had some questions, for instance, about pairing an ultim with a Red Edge MX Blue, but that's not something that's available. It's just with the Red Edge that has the firmware update that allows that synchronization of the triggering. Are you currently working on adding RTK or PPK capability to your sensors? So right now, the PPK integrations that are available are through some of our OEM partners. So like Quantum Systems with their Trinity, for instance. And then there are a couple other providers that have their own PPK systems that do integration onto DJI drones. So I know Field of View, for instance, out of North Dakota is one of them. They've got PPK integrations, and they've integrated with all of our sensors. So for like a Matrice 200 or a 300, for instance. So there are a couple options there, but that's through third parties at this time. I've got a question here about ultim. Okay, so it's recommended to fly at 360 feet AGL. If you have to fly lower than that flight altitude, what is the swath of the camera?
So I would say just to use our flight calculator to determine those exact numbers. It all really depends on your altitude.
But yeah, that's a good recommendation on the pre-flight calculator. I think it's just micasense.com/flight calculator. But that's a good one to use if you're trying to figure out what resolution you need, what flight speed. You can enter in the desired, flight altitude. It'll generate what the GSD will be at that specific flight altitude, and it'll show you the time between capture for the parameters you've entered. So you can double check to make sure it's, at least once per second or a little bit higher than once per second for red edge or dual camera, or at or higher 1.5 seconds between capture for ultim.
Right, and you can certainly fly below 360 feet. I would say you can fly at 50 meters, which I guess is 150 feet. And the most important thing is you need to have a good distance between the top of your area of interest. So for example, the tree canopy or the crop that you're flying, it can't be too high. It can't be so high that it's getting relatively close to your camera, but you could fly easily, I would say 30, 40, 50 meters over turf and 100 meters over a canopy. It all really depends. You can do some experimentation on your own.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Another question here. I think Callum, you can help with this one. So before and after flights, you take a picture of the panel, the calibrator reflectance panel for the radiometric calibration. But for long flights that are, let's say, more than 40 minutes, could you apply a weighted calibration of the pre and post flight calibration images?
Yes, you could. You're kind of a little bit dependent on what the kind of photogrammetry softwares provide. Some providers may offer that functionality, others may not. To my understanding, I think SimActive Correlator 3D and Agisoft Metashape can take pre and post flight panels into consideration. We also have third-party open source GitHub code where written in Python, which the functionality isn't there as such, but the tools are there to implement that yourself if that was something of interest. So you could have a linear relationship between your start and your end point, or if you came down for a battery change and you took more panels, you could integrate multiple ones that way.
Awesome, sounds good. Another question about mission planning apps. So what would be the recommendation for a mission planner when using the Phantom 4 Pro?
I haven't actually flown the Phantom 4 Pro with a MicaSense camera. So I can imagine you could also use DJI Pilot, but pretty much anything that allows you to do a mapping mission that is creating or importing a polygon, and it lets you set the distance between the flight lines, whether that's the numbers you get from our flight calculator or by inputting the specifications on the sensor size into the software. Yeah, so all you need is the flight lines and the distance between the flight lines, and then the camera will just trigger itself based off the overlap mode. So just anything that is able to create a mapping mission would be my answer.
Nice. Yeah, I know a lot of them have that custom camera option, so you can enter in the parameters for your red edge, for instance. We will fly the MicaSense on a seaplane. So they're not using a drone, using a manned aircraft there at different altitudes. Does it mean we have to adjust the settings for the flight as far as target altitudes when setting up the camera?
Yeah, I would say in theory you do, because the overlap target altitude you choose is based off of that altitude, of course. So if you are having very drastic changes in altitude, that might need to change. But at such a high altitude you'd be flying with a manned aircraft, I can't imagine it would change that much. You may consider using timer mode in that case and just setting it to trigger every second or 2 or 3, depending on your altitude. Other than that, you could also do a more complex integration using one of our APIs to trigger more smartly based off of your altitude. And that's something you could definitely email us about, and we can get into in more detail.
Sounds good. Yeah, good recommendation on the timer mode. Because I know the overlap one, we've got the setting too, where it's to avoid extra pictures during takeoff and landing. We've got that threshold, right, of where it'll start capturing based on the target altitude.
Right, and timer mode will also has options like that, so it won't be triggering on the ground. It'll start triggering once it hits an altitude. So you can just do that at a pretty low altitude, like your minimum altitude that you'd expect, and then it would just trigger every couple seconds after that.
Okay, this is a good question. Best way to remove the DLS2 cable without breaking it. I know those parts are a little more sensitive. So best way to remove that gently for if you're swapping out sensors.
That's a great question. That's something I've struggled with myself. I'm assuming they're using a Red Edge M or MX or 3 because it's much easier to remove it on the ultim. But the DF13 cable that goes directly into the camera, I agree, is very difficult to remove. I've actually had to get advice from our lab technician on the best way to do that. And I wish I could have the webcam on right now and show you right now. But what you can do is with the writing facing the right way up on the labels above the ports, you can get a small flathead screwdriver, and you're basically pressing down on the top of the cable connector and maybe gently tugging on the cable. And that's generally how I've done it. Personally, I kind of just keep the cable always in there. I understand that's not always possible in the field. So I think that's a great question, and I will create a knowledge base article on that today. And maybe Emily can send it around.
Yeah, it's a good idea for the knowledge base article. And we did start to include 2 of those cables now in kits so that you have a backup if something does happen. But yeah, like Stephen said, it's something we've got our eye on as far as something we can improve in the future. All right, so we've got a question about the dual camera sensor and mission planning here. So I recently purchased the dual sensor. Before the start of the flight, I take a photo of the calibration panel, and then I do the same after the flight. Is this the correct way to calibrate? How to use the DLS2 along with that? And are my recordings calibrated, or do I still have to do something in post-processing? So general overview of the radiometric calibration recommendations.
Yeah, so with the dual cam, it's kind of an interesting case because depending on how you take the panel captures, if you're just not looking at the web interface at all, and you're just pressing the button on the red camera, I think the blue camera too, and the DLS button, you can press any of those to trigger the panel capture. In any case, you hold it over the panel and take the capture, and it's kind of weird because you want to hold it in such a way that you're going to get a capture with both cameras, and that can be kind of tricky to do. So yeah, a capture before and after the flight, and as Callum said, if you have any battery changes, it's a good practice to take the captures then as well. And that is used for radiometric correction. What we usually say is during a clear or uniformly overcast day, you can process using just the panel data, and using the DLS irradiance data is more for if there's any changing lighting conditions that it needs to correct for.
I can add just a little bit more on the end of that.
Perfect.
In terms of when you're integrating those pictures and that actual calibration within the software, you will need to select the choices that you want for the calibration. So if you're in Pix4D, Agisoft, or Correlator, you will need to provide information as to whether you want to calibrate with the panel itself, or in combination with the DLS to take in that irradiance data. So that is something you need to actively choose within the post-processing process.
All right, so we've got a question about related to mission planning. So what's the best AGL and GSD for flying with red edge? And a question as well, so around planning that, which I think that relates to the flight calculator that we mentioned before. That's a good tool for that. But maybe Callum, you can speak to trying to figure out what GSD that you need based on your mission and what you're trying to get out of the data.
Sure. Probably the number one thing to consider is what the loads are in the area you're flying in, what altitude you can fly at, and then once those considerations are out the way, you need to assess what you're actually trying to do on that flight. What is it that you're trying to detect or gain information upon, and what ground sampling distance or resolution do you need to realize that? And you've got other considerations such as how high you are, etc., which have to be taken in. But really, you need to just determine what resolution you need to answer the question or to provide the information that you're looking for, and then go from there would be my recommendation. There isn't a best AGL or GSD for all flights. All flights are different because they'll have different purposes.
Yeah, for instance, it'll on how big the plant or crop that you're looking at is, and how many pixels that you want of that plant for the analysis, whether it's, if you're doing some kind of plant counting, for instance, you would need a higher resolution. If you're just generally doing targeted scouting, you could fly higher and have a coarser resolution. So the next question is around making sure that you have essentially post-flight, how do you know that you have all the photos that have been taken? Is that something where you can connect to the Wi-Fi interface to check, or do you just have to wait until you load the photos into your photogrammetry software?
That's a great question. So again, you can go into the web interface and go to the map tab, and there's something called the coverage estimator. And it can sometimes take maybe a minute to load, but what it will do is it will load up a list of every single folder on your SD card or your flash drive, and it will show you, for example, 0001 set, and it'll say like 235 captures, and you can check that box for that flight and then press next and choose your altitude, and it will show you a little color diagram showing you how your overlap went for that mission. And it's just kind of a good way just to check to see if you got any captures at all, as opposed to looking at the main page and seeing the current storage amount. With the coverage map tool, you can see exactly how many captures you got and a visual representation of how the overlap went.
Great. And then we have a question about the 128 gigabyte SD cards. Can those be used with older Red Edge sensors, a Red Edge MX that's 2 years old, for instance? Can that be compatible if you do a firmware update?
Yeah, definitely. So the larger SD cards are compatible with any Red Edge M or MX, as long as you have the latest version, or even any version within the past year that you've updated the camera with. You should be able to use those larger SD cards, but you cannot use anything larger than 32 on the Red Edge 3, but that hasn't been sold, I think, in over 3 years.
Okay, sounds good. So I've got a question related to calibration that Callum, I think you can help with. So how accurate is the calibration panel on a cloudy day, and if there's shadowing from trees while you're flying the mission and clouds passing by? So on those more kind of challenging weather days, not ideal lighting conditions, how accurate is the calibration going to be?
Yeah, so I think how accurate it's going to be as accurate as it can be within those kind of conditions. If you're in a cloudy environment and it's uniform, then it's going to give you a real good calibration. If you're in an environment where there are sort of rolling heavy clouds coming in, what we typically call popcorn clouds, that can be a lot trickier for the panel and the DLS2 to correct for. Essentially, we don't recommend flying in those conditions if it's possible. On a kind of uniform cloudy day, you're going to be pretty good. In terms of the trees, the shadowing of the trees, we recommend flying within 2 hours of solar noon to try and reduce the shadowing effect. The calibration itself isn't going to do too much to reduce those shadows if they're actively there.
Do we have any videos on how to use the MX as far as just best practices for mission planning and ways to calibrate?
So we created the video, the ultim, Skyport, and the M300, and it's the exact same workflow if you're using the MX. And we also just created a video. I don't think it's been published yet, but an updated video on processing Red Edge MX data in Pix4D Mapper. So yeah, it's pretty much it's a very similar workflow with both cameras, the Red Edge MX and the ultim. But I don't think they ask which software they're using, but we do have tutorials for Agisoft and for Pix4D. But we are also working to create more videos.
Yeah, adding to the YouTube channel, which would be great. And I think even it's just called best practices for using MicaSense sensors, I think is the name of the article on the knowledge base. And that one too has recommendations for, how to take a panel capture and set everything up for triggering. So that could be a good resource as well. Okay, is there a code or program you can recommend for turning images into data matrices based on pixel information for analysis?
Yes, there's we've mentioned them previously, the sort of Python GitHub code that we have. You could use that library, or if you've already processed your data in one of the standard photogrammetry softwares, there's nothing stopping you reading that information within Python, or probably MATLAB as well, C++, to deal with that at a more kind of matrix approach. So you could easily, within that threshold on indices or specific values, programmatically.
As far as mission planning, what would be the minimum height for AGL for flying the Red Edge to make sure that you're able to do the band alignment correctly? So any recommendations on minimum flight altitude, or you could speak as well to, if people are doing ground captures, stationary captures.
You could easily fly at 30, 40, 50 meters. I think that's fine. But the most important thing is how tall the objects you're capturing are. So you can I've captured turf from 5, 10 meters, no problem. You can align that single capture. But in that same, from 10 meters, if you had a 5-meter tree in the capture and you're trying to capture it from 10 meters AGL, you'll definitely get the parallax issues at the top of the tree. I think I've heard that there should be a ratio of, so if you have a 10-meter tree, you should be like 30 meters above the canopy of that tree. So it's like a 3-to-1 ratio, I think is a good
rule of thumb.
But yeah, you have rule of thumb, exactly. So I think 50 meters is generally fine. But again, if you have very tall objects in the frame, the closer the objects are to the camera, the harder they're going to be to align.
Sounds good. And Callum, I know you've had some experience doing the closer range capture, so maybe you can speak to that and some of the alignment work or results that you've gotten from that.
Yeah, I think most of what Stephen said is exactly correct with that work as well. That's more looking at taking static images from, say, a pole-mounted system or from a very small altitude, and that's something we use open source Python library for. It's not something we can say works in all conditions because it depends on the features you're capturing, but we've had good luck, good fortune doing that on a number of different sites, whether it's seedlings from 1 or 2 meters altitude or over crop-based areas from 5 or 10 meters.
So we got a question here about the DLS models. So what's the difference between the older DLS1, the first model, and the current DLS2. I got my Red Edge camera in 2015-16 with the older DLS. Do I need to upgrade to the DLS2? So the main updates for the first model and the second is we've integrated the GPS. So it used to be the separate GPS puck and then the DLS, two separate modules. They're combined now just for ease of use and integration. And then we've also increased the number of sensors. So it used to be just the 5 sensors to correlate with the 5 for Red Edge. Now we've got 12 different irradiate sensors, and they're all at slightly different angles to help with calculating sun angle in addition to measuring the radiance. So that's just been an improvement with as far as the calibration capability for that one. There is an option to upgrade to the DLS2 if you would like. I don't know if anything else you can add, Callum, as far as the ability of having those additional irradiant sensors and at the slightly different angles.
It's just going to give more information, which is going to help create a better calibration, really, from the analytics side of things.
Okay, so I've got a question related to the 10 band, the dual camera system. So we have a lot of problems here in Ireland with farmers spraying fields with slurry and then the runoff polluting the rivers. I have a dual camera system, wondering if there's anything I can use to help. So using the dual camera system to monitor river health or whatever kind of local water bodies. Maybe Callum, can you speak to that? I know we've had some interest in using dual camera for monitoring algal blooms and some use of looking at chlorophyll A content in water. Maybe that relates to this a bit.
Yeah, I'd say directly relates. I would think some of the stuff that we've seen is, you follow the water body where all those nutrients are going in, and a lot of work we've seen is people using dual camera system or satellite data to study algal blooms, eutrophication, that sort of thing, where all those nutrients are ending up in a somewhat static water body, and as temperatures are rising, you're getting that decrease in oxygen and algal blooms are forming. So that would be a really powerful remote sensing possibility there with the 10 band system, especially when you've got different types of algae which could be forming, some of which are very, very dangerous to humans and for consumption of food if that water body is used for within the food chain. So yeah, there's a whole host of things you could look at. You could sample the river itself and have a look at the vegetation along the sides, sort of riparian vegetation. Is that increasing at certain times? Is there incredibly dense due to maybe a huge amount of nutrients coming in? I think there's a world of possibilities there for using that sensor.
Sounds good. Got a question about flying trial plots specifically, and if any recommendations for settings for flying that type of scenario. I would say for that kind of situation where you are covering a smaller area, you can get away with flying lower and getting the highest resolution possible. Especially since it's a research type setting where the more resolution the better probably in that scenario. So yeah, I would say you could get away with flying lower. You will have to fly slower in that situation as well to make sure that the camera can keep up with triggering. But that would be my general feedback on it. Any other feedback, Callum and Stephen?
I think the only thing I would maybe add to that is, depending on your access to the area you're surveying and speed and time, always go for a smaller area when you're trying these tests, just to speed it all up in case there are issues, so you can get out there and keep doing some more flights if necessary to dial those settings in.
Okay. If you try and create an AVI, so Advanced Vegetation Index, along with an NDVI map, will the ultim be enough to extract phenology characteristics? So I guess some of that will the plant you're looking at and what the resolution is.
Yeah, I think that'll very much depend on the crop that you're looking at, the time of year as well, especially in terms of the life cycle of that particular crop. But yeah, it should be doable. We've got lots of researchers who are using both the dual cam and the ultim on small plot trial areas, things like that, where they're studying in depth that change in phenology over not only time but also with different nutrient applications and things like that to see how the plant responds and changes. So certainly I can't speak for the Advanced Vegetation Index so much, but certainly a lot more. I've seen a lot more research using the NDV IMAP and different NDRE variants.
Yeah, I know specifically for NDVI, I think people have been doing average plot bigger as something that they're looking at, averaging the NDVI across once they establish the trial plot boundaries. Okay, so what's the difference between Red Edge and the MX version in terms of wavebands used? So between the different models of Red Edge, they're looking at the same wavelengths, or the same, the sensors are using the same filters. Between the MX and the dual camera, we have added 5 new wavebands. So that was a coastal blue band, a new green band, a new red band, and then 2 new Red Edge bands. So I've got just one more question, I think, here, and then we can wrap it up. So the scale of 3 to 1, as far as what you were recommending, Stephen, for figuring out altitude versus crop height. So the 3 to 1 ratio, is that valid for all crops? So for instance, if the crop length is 1 meter, should I take the flight at 3 meters AGL?
Like, that's not something we've tested. I think we technically say you should fly over 50 meters, and anything below that is kind of something you would need to experiment with to make sure it works for your exact use case. But I have taken captures of things that are, say, 1.5 meters high and stood up on a ladder and taken a capture from 3 meters, and I almost stitches together fine. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer for that, but it's kind of something you'll have to experiment with.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Callum and Stephen, for joining me, and thanks everybody for your attendance and questions, and hope everyone has a good rest of the day.
That's it for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed that Q&A session and got something out of it. I think during the Q&A, there were a few mentions of links. Stephen, where are people going to be able to find that?
Yeah, in the description of this podcast, you should be able to find some specific links to the questions that were answered. So our knowledge base is a pretty good resource for getting all of your questions answered. If there were any questions that were not answered, then feel free to reach out to us at support@MicaSense.com.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks so much.
Talk to you later.
Talk to you later.